Could you please introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Igor Trauschwitzer. I teach military, international, diplomatic history with an emphasis on the Cold War era at Ohio University. I've been doing that for about 7 or 8 years there now. I'm generally interested in strategy, policy, the intersection of that with military operations, also civil military relations in the U.S. And alliances in the Cold War era.
Okay. And what brought you to the research library?
I'm working on a book on Maxwell Taylor, who was an Army general, well, among other things, in the Second World War, but what I'm really interested in is Taylor's post-war career in the first 2 decades of the Cold War, where he keeps showing up in very interesting places, anywhere from West Point, where he's superintendent, to Berlin, where he briefly commands in the, I guess, summer 1949 to early 51 time period in Korea, towards the end of the war there. The Pentagon, where he's sort of a critic, I suppose, of Eisenhower's defense priorities and of this sort of sense of absolute nuclear deterrence, which he doesn't feel is particularly credible, or maybe he's just defending the army. And eventually in Kennedy's White House in the early 60s, by way of maybe coincidence, and that Kennedy is looking for someone who can investigate what had gone wrong in the Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961 in Cuba. And he turns to a retired Army general who he thinks has the same critique of the system, and they get along. Which means that Taylor, who's retired at one point, comes back in uniform as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I think the second week on the job, the Cuban Missile Crisis breaks. And he ends up as ambassador in South Vietnam in 1964 to 1965, so he's in all the debates over escalation there. So I think he's a very interesting figure, and what then draws me here is that several people he worked with, who worked with him or clashed with him, have their papers here. From George Marshall, whose staff he had served on, and who picks him as West Point superintendent in 1945, in fact, to Andrew Goodpaster, who worked in Eisenhower's White House as an Army general, but then sort of on the, I guess in uniform, as staff secretary in the 50s, and works with Taylor on the Joint Staff in the mid-1960s. To a few others he'd served with in Europe in the end of the 40s, beginning of the 50s, and in Korea. And so there's sort of a range of records here that I feel I need to see, I also wanted to see for this study.
Okay. And while you've been looking through those records, is there anything particularly interesting you found in any of those collections?
Yeah, a few things. I thought I was coming in, so I've looked at some of these records before, although from a somewhat different angle, and probably 12 years ago in my doctoral research on the U.S. Army and the Cold War more broadly. And so I thought I was going to primarily look for specific questions. Why did George Marshall pick Taylor as West Point superintendent? What did he see in him? How does Goodpaster recall the sort of clashes between Taylor and Eisenhower, who Goodpaster was friends with both in some ways? And I found some of these things very plainly explained. But then I hadn't expected to find as much on Vietnam as I did. I knew that Goodpaster had served there as deputy commanding general for MACV, for Military Assistance Command Vietnam from either late 1968 or early 69 on forward. But he comments actually quite a bit on 1964 and 65 when he is Goodpaster still on the Joint Staff, And Taylor has moved on to ambassadorship, and so Goodpaster kept some of the official records, telegrams that came in, that helped me establish at what point Taylor, who was an advocate of air power and of bombing North Vietnam, but was quite leery about American ground forces in South Vietnam, at what point he began to shift towards the position that we really needed to deploy. And it seems it's really quite late. As late as April 1965, Taylor is still fighting that notion that the U.S. should put, I guess, significant number of boots on the ground, because he thinks that that would just mean the Vietnamese would hand over the war to the Americans, and he's not sure that it's winnable for a foreign army. By any case, I had not expected to find much of that. It turns out that Goodpaster had researched that issue in 1979 or 80 or 81 in preparation for congressional testimony. Actually, 81, I suppose. And so it's all neatly packaged in these research files. And it's really quite terrific, because it shows this kind of progression. Found a little bit on both Taylor and Goodpaster on I suppose both in retirement in the late 1970s on the Committee on the Present Danger, which was a sort of an anti-detente group in some ways of lobbyists, or rather lobbying against pushing arms control too far, or rather pushing arms limitation too far. But what's very interesting there is that Goodpaster very plainly puts this in one of the many oral history interviews he gave at the time, that, he and Taylor could get along even though they didn't necessarily agree on a lot of things. And one thing they didn't agree on was what sort of a strategic missile force the U.S. should maintain in the late 70s. They're both aware of the need to continue to contain the Soviets, but were one. Goodpaster wants what he calls a rough equivalency. Taylor just basically says, well, no, we don't need more than the Soviets. We just need to be able to retain the capability to hurt them significantly, which will serve as a deterrent. And so they're nice little insights into the evolution of strategic thinking. Really from about 1945 on for about 30 years. That I had not expected to find, so that was really nice.
That's great. Is there anything else you'd like to add about your research visit, your experience here at the research library?
Not terribly much. It's a very friendly place with tremendously well organized and well done finding aids. I mean, down to the folder, it's really great what you can do in terms of preparation, and so makes it much more efficient.
Great. Well, thank you very much for speaking with us.
Thank you. Welcome.
Mm-hmm.